Of the many curios contained within the depths of the oldest house, there is one that is particularly grim. It's not an object of power, altered item, or anything you'd expect. Concealed within the maintenance sector lies the NSC Power Plant, central power station for the oldest house. Overlooked by most FBC personnel due to its mundane appearance, it is quite possibly one of the Bureau's dirtiest little secrets. One whose true nature is on a need-to-know basis. The NSC Power Plant doesn't just power the Bureau, rather, that's the unintended side effect of its actual purpose, as a containment chamber for former Bureau Director, Broderick Northmoor. So, there's a lot to unpack here, but let's first get into some tasty backstory, since Northmoor was a pretty important dude within the history and lore of the FBC. And then we can tackle just how a director became a glorified reactor. From the various documents found in the game, we know there has been at least 4 directors of the Federal Bureau of Control: Faden, Trench, Northmoor, and Theodore Ashe Sr. As there are huge gaps in information, we're uncertain of the length of these directors' tenures. In fact, we don't even know when the FBC was founded, or if there was any precursor organizations to it. Documents in the game only go as far back as 1954, with the only relevant info being that the Bureau was still considered young back then. Ashe Sr., who was the oldest named director, is the only one to have not been appointed to that position by the service weapon and the board. In fact, he never stepped foot inside the oldest house, as it wasn't discovered until August 4th, 1964. 1 week after his funeral. This is where Northmoor comes in. According to the recordings found in the Foundation DLC, made by Head of Research Theodore Ashe Jr., who, obviously, is the son of the previous director, Northmoor was just acting director until he entered the oldest house. Once inside, he would end up discovering the service weapon on a pedestal in front of, presumably, the Nihil. There's a discrepancy here between this audio log and the case file on the item, but whatevs. The simple act of him picking up the weapon would have huge ramifications not only for himself, but the Bureau on the whole. For example, it greatly impacted not only the role of the director, but also introduced the board, in the process establishing the requirements of the selection process for all future holders of the title. The director became a liaison between the board and the FBC, as one of the most powerful para-utilitarians alive. A para-utilitarian is someone who can wield paranatural powers, and therefore can safely control objects of power. Whilst not all para-utilitarians will become the director, all directors have to have this innate ability. Up until Jesse, he was the most powerful one to date. Northmoor made the position of the director more than just a name on an office plaque. The acting director role that he himself stepped into the oldest house with can no longer exist under this new system. In the eyes of the board, you're either the director or you're not. And considering that the selection process is basically Russian roulette, it's do or die. Plus, vitally, the director serves a purpose as one of the most powerful forms of defense for the Bureau, board, and the world. That's one of the main reasons why Trench would later create the Prime Candidate program, but that's a story for another day. In a nutshell, the key things that Northmoor was a part of include being the first director selected by the board, being the reason why the oldest house gained that name and the Bureau relocated to it, finding and using the hotline, the one direct form of communication with the board outside of the astral plane, likely pushed for the acquirement and containment of more stuff, be them objects of power or altered items, further helped to develop the Bureau's practices, and presumably was one of the biggest factors in making the Bureau into what it is today. However, his appointment as director was problematic from the start. This was entirely down to his personality, and how interacting with an entity such as the board aggravated his negative traits. The guy was a bureaucrat, okay? He craved power and control, and my god, did he get it. Not only did he get full control over the FBC as an organization, but obtained the blessing of a being incomprehensible to most. He also acquired a level of paranatural ability or power that few could ever hope to obtain. His allegiance also switched from being America-centric to board-centric, taking everything they said at face value. He lacked any skepticism to the story he was being fed by them because it gave him everything he desired in life. They gave him a grandiose narrative where he was the center of it all, even though that role is to be filled by the director and not specifically by Northmoor himself, which is an important distinction to make. The board made him into one of the most important men alive and, without meaning to, implied that by acquiring and controlling more items, he could gain even more power. It was the perfect lure for a guy like him, and he went off the deep end. Unfreaking surprisingly, he developed not only a messiah complex, but megalomania. He became disconnected from his very own staff, but especially those who were uneasy about the board and the impact this was all having on him. He dismissed any concerns raised, even when it was clear that what was happening to him was destructive and dangerous. He completely lost sight of what his actual role was as the director, instead just fixating on power. Northmoor's response to his medical results is particularly insightful into the state of his mind during the later stages of his directorship. You can see so many of his worst traits out on full display throughout his response. The most revealing ones being that he saw his powers as divine collaboration or as gifts, how the only opinion who mattered to him was the board's, and how Dr. Rosen couldn't possibly understand the nature of his powers. He had some real big brain energy going on by this point. Another interesting aspect is the fact he wished to conceal his health status from all other FBC personnel, but most notably Ash Jr., head of research and unofficial second banana at the Bureau. This is representative of how he viewed and distrusted his own staff by that point, as well as his particular dislike of Ash Jr. Tensions between the two had already been hinted at in earlier correspondence, likely stemming from Ash Jr. being insubordinate and not viewing him, or by extension the board, favourably. With all that explained, we can finally get into how Northmoor was confined to the power plant, even if it is a tad unclear. Gotta love control being purposely vague. So, according to Trench's Northmoor hotline call, as well as mentioned by Jessie when she reaches the top of the NSC, Northmoor lost control of his powers. He either didn't know the limits of his abilities, or more likely, actively tried to push past them until he became overwhelmed. This loss of control manifested itself as producing impossible amounts of heat and energy, an ironic reflection of his explosive and power-hungry personality. Trench, who was deputy chief at the time, would propose a solution to the ongoing crisis. The NSC was built to contain and siphon the excess energy produced by Northmoor's body. NSC is the acronym for the Northmoor Sarcophagus Container. Its full name is only found one time during the entirety of the game, right at the top of the power plant, next to these screens. All other times it's mentioned, it either uses the acronym or the name is partly redacted. Even in Trench's hotline call, he only alludes to what went down. He never outright says it.
I suppose at the end of the day, a director's most basic duty is to keep the lights on.
But don't worry, peeps, because things, they get much worse. Firstly, Bureau higher-ups have actively concealed the nature of the plant from lower-level staff. Staff in the executive sector, and even those that are running the NSC, seem completely unaware of what's actually generating the power. Even Arish, who served as maintenance security chief, till your boy gets promoted, doesn't appear to know what's inside the NSC, or why Salvador, his boss, had even sent into it to protect it. He just knows that what's inside it is dangerous, and that Dr. Darlin seemed to believe that it would be a target. When asked about what exactly the power plant is, Arish only has this to say.
Listen, I only know what Salvador told me, but I know it generates all the electricity for the Bureau, and it's got two very simple rules. Rule 1, keep it below a certain temperature. Rule 2, don't ever open it. Oh, and 3, it's classified, so I shouldn't ask.
Sounds like secrets are standard operating procedure around here.
Oh, yeah, it's all part of the job.
When the head of sector security doesn't even know what they're protecting because it's classified, that tells us a lot about the levels of secrecy we're dealing with here. Secondly, the use of the term sarcophagus may hint at the fact that the energy being produced by Northmoor's body is nuclear in nature. Parallels can be drawn from the name to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant sarcophagus, used to contain the radiation produced from the remains of Reactor 4. Even more curious, and something that I myself didn't realise, despite watching a documentary on its construction, is that the new shelter that was built to replace the original Chernobyl sarcophagus is called the New Safe Confinement, or NSC. If Control's NSC was nuclear-powered, then that would explain why the hiss getting to it would be exceptionally dangerous and explosive. Northmoor's body serves as a reactor core and therefore could easily be corrupted. If that were to happen, then it would be inconceivably destructive and destabilizing, even in a vast paranatural building such as the oldest house. Look, even if the building held, house shifts would mean that there would be no way to safely contain radiation or to create any exclusion zones. And that's without even getting into the fact that the building is located within New York City. Disaster is an understatement. Now, of course, this is just my theory, but it is based on interesting info and strangely specific coincidences. Finally, we get to easily the most horrifying aspect of the NSC, the detail that disturbed me the most and really got under my skin. Broderick Northmoor? Yeah, he's very much alive in there. In fact, this isn't even up for debate, as it's confirmed multiple times by the game, which is what makes it so grim. The first time it's brought up, it's implied by Atty, which is why it can be so easily missed by players. He does, after all, speak in a unique way. When talking about how the water pumps and power generators need to be fixed, Atty refers to the destabilizing of the power plant as this.
And the pensioner inside is starting to feel the band around his head tighten.
As Control is set in 2019 and Northmoor is the director in the 60s, he would be a pensioner by now if he was still alive. Atty also can randomly say another piece of dialogue that supports this if you hang around in his office long enough after the previous cutscene. These colourful pieces of dialogue are more literal than you'd expect. The next time it's mentioned is in the NSC document found at the top of the power plant. In the document, it refers to whosever name was redacted in the present tense. We can piece together from Trench's Northmoor call, as well as the big old Northmoor written on the side of the plant, what that redacted name is. Finally, the most concrete evidence to support him being alive is in a conversation that Arish can be overheard having late in the game.
Hey, I found a file on the old director, Northmoor. Didn't list any dated death. You know anything about that?
Could be an error. The records staff process a lot of data. Maybe it just slipped through.
Yeah, maybe.
It's not an oversight or a clerical error. The evidence Control presents us with refutes this, even if death would have been a kinder end for him. There is no date, because the dude's alive. And what an awful way to live out your days, confined to a chamber with no human contact, sustenance, or stimulation, trapped alone in a form of purgatory to the day you hopefully pass of old age. If you can even die. I mean, we don't know for certain that his paranatural powers don't translate to a prolonged life expectancy or form of immortality, which would make it even crueler. Of the many fates worse than death, this one is particularly horrendous. If this is what is considered humane by Bureau standards, then I'm good not knowing what was considered inhumane. Generally, I see the FBC as more morally decent than the SPC Foundation, which of course inspired it. That being said, this is something that the SPC Foundation would do, so good job disappointing me, guys. The bar was set so low. Anyway, that's the dirtiest secret of the Federal Bureau of Control. Hope you found it as morbidly interesting as I did. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. Till next time, later, Spaghetti.